Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Young. One of the things I'm trying to do is do some educational sessions on different aspects of government, including the fiscal management cycle. There's a lot of rhetoric as we build up in elections, whether it's provincial, municipal, or federal government level, in terms of the whole budget cycle. In the private sector, typically, a budget cycle is a window of about 3-month period. Usually, if your year-end, fiscal year-end is December 31st, you usually start your budget planning somewhere around July or August. And then you basically get your final sign-off on your budget around November. Within government, it's a very long drawn-out process that takes about 10 to 12 months. And there's a lot of people involved with the process. And basically, there's usually estimates that are starting to establish in terms of the priorities. Now, let's stop there for a second here. You're going to hear during the election campaign in terms of the budget cycle, in terms of priorities, in terms of setting a budget. The NDP and the Liberals have been constantly drilling the fact that the Conservatives don't seem to listen to anybody when they do their budget cycle. That's not necessarily a true statement. If you really want to learn a little bit more about the budget cycle, I would encourage you to go to the Government of Canada site and actually look at the budget committees. There's actually meetings they have with different groups, and that means taxpayers actually can come in and present. Usually you see major groups like the Canadian Federation of Independent Business or the Canadian Manufacturers Association, the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers come in and make presentations of kind of what they're looking for in terms of policy to help support their constituents they support. Now, the NDP supporters and the Liberal Party have a tendency to say that basically Harper only listens to big business speak, and that's not necessarily true, because if you look at the boutique tax cuts and other things he's done over the past year, he's actually listening to what the low and middle income Canadians actually want. All you hear is a negative rhetoric from the Liberal or NDP parties about income tax splitting or other aspect that the top 1% don't pay enough taxes. That's what you hear, because you know why that is said? It is said that way in a purpose. Purpose is they're trying to pander to that they're the social activists, that they're looking out for the little guy. Now, the best way to solve a problem with social programs or social assistance is a good job. A strong economy will flourish in terms of creating the right job prospects and opportunities. If you do not provide the right environment to create investment or create the right type of jobs, then you're not helping the people to get off that low income to middle income range to kind of grow it. It's easy to say that Stephen Harper hasn't done enough on the middle class, but in essence his programs as part of the budget cycle and setting the priorities, he's actually done that. And I would encourage you to go out and look at CNN videos on it, or listen to what Hillary Clinton has said about Canada's middle class, or even just what the world has said. And the reason I say that is because setting priorities is not just about setting priorities for corporate. It's also setting priorities for the environment, setting priorities for seniors, setting priorities to help support the provinces, from infrastructure to healthcare, daycare, all that. That's part of the budget cycle. Let's talk about what just came out recently. There's been a lot of rhetoric about, with the drop down in oil prices, that's going to impact government revenue. Basically what the government does is it has that bucket of income tax that comes in from a corporate, personnel, GST. That's the bulk of where the revenue comes in. And part of that is they get some royalties from Alberta as part of the royalty management, part of the oil sands process. They also rely on corporate taxes in terms of that being strong, along with employment. So as we've seen right now, the government is actually running a surplus from the April to June period. So it's April, May, and June, the first quarter. Now, that's an interesting thing, because the bulk of the oil drop in the fall of the oil prices we've seen over the last year started around July last year, where we see the bulk, but the bulk of the real decreases happened in November. And that's when basically, as part of the budget cycle, the government had completed the budget cycle, and then all of a sudden they had a huge drop off, and they were concerned where oil was going to fall out in terms of its revenue measurement, in terms of the battle testing the budget. Right now, Goodale has a habit, because as typical what Goodale does, he likes to speak before he even has facts. And he also seems to think just because he was a former finance minister that he's an expert in all aspects of finance, which he is not. He's basically, I'm not even sure he looked at the details, but basically he's just basically saying the government didn't do any work in terms of research. He should know better than that when he makes those statements. The government battle tests these budgets, but when they came into January, February, they thought possibly they might see rebound in terms of the oil and some of the other aspects of the economy, and it actually worsened. So it only makes sense to take a stopgap, to take a relook, to make sure that you've got your assumptions tested. And basically when they went in, they had a certain amount of assumptions. So what you're seeing now with the surplus that you're seeing here is that the worst part of the economy, based on what the private sector is saying, was the first half of the year. The last part of the year, we're seeing good forecasts come in on Europe, Asia, as well as basically the US. And since 75% of all exports go to the US, it's a good indication that Canada's revenues will continually support that. And as long as we see, and we're still seeing good stability with the labor market and housing starts and consumer spending, so we're still seeing that the projections the government went in are still showing that they're on target to still have a balanced budget or a little bit of a surplus, or what they originally targeted this for the fiscal year 2015 to 2016. Now, a lot of you are going to hear the rhetoric about that from the NDP and all that, and even Kevin Page came out to speak about it. But these guys are only talking holistic views. They don't go into the details. And the reason why is because, again, they're pandering stuff and they want to point faults. Because all you ever hear from the NDP is it's a pro-oil, and that's not necessarily true. Let's talk about what goes into a budget model. They make certain assumptions on GDP. GDP is very critical. So when they went into their forecast, they actually thought GDP would be 2% this year. It's actually going to come in a little less, about 1.2%. So that's why they say there's probably pressure on things. But the indications is the impact to the government results. There's no indication, even with lower GDP, that they won't hit their targets. Let's talk about consumer spending. That's a big driver that drives GST. It looks like it's probably going to be anywhere from 1.5% to 2.5% this year, which is a good sign that should support GST. Exports itself, they're expecting exports will rebound from September to the last part of the fourth quarter this year, which should also help Canada in terms of its corporate profits, its other revenue from excise and consumption taxes. Let's talk about corporate profits. This is a critical area because I pulled this up, is because it declined year over year for the first 6 months this year, but based on the uptick that we're projected in the last quarter of this year, and it's not just me saying it. You can go out and look at what CIBC says. You can go look at what BMO says. You can go look at what TD Economics says. And I picked TD Economics for a reason. They typically support Liberal and NDP more than they do the Conservative. In essence, the TD Economics former CEO is actually doing work for the Liberal government in Ontario, so you can see how they're connected more to the Liberal Party. If you don't believe me, you can check it out. He's actually doing work on the OPG. That's just to clarify that the TD Bank typically is more pro-Liberal. Let's talk about the labor market. You constantly hear about jobs, but Canada's done a sufficient job over the last year or so to create 200,000 new jobs. If we're creating net jobs, the likelihood of we're drawing more unemployment expenses to bring down the payout, we're still having solid payroll, so that's the income taxes that we should see coming in. And this shows you the employment rate is pretty consistent to where they thought they would be during the budget. Now let's talk about budgetary revenue, and that's where I was talking about. There's no indication that when they went into the for this year that they're not going to hit their target of $235 billion this year in terms of revenue. There's no indication based on what we've seen now, and the latest stats on the budget surplus from April to June. It shows you where was a weak period of time, and we're starting to see pickup come up in the last quarter of this year and going into by the end of the budget cycle, which is March 31st, 2006. So we're probably in pretty good shape so far, because there's no indication that we're going to see that anything else is going to deteriorate. Now let's look at program expenses. I brought this up because Thomas Mulcair made a statement the other day about that he will cut the Senate. Now, he can't just remove the Senate. That's a constitutional amendment, and he's got to get province buy-in. Plus, that's not significant enough dollars that's going to matter anything in the budget cycle. If you look at the budget expenses, like you're looking at here right now, if I look at the government spends about $263 billion in program spending. Basically, most of it goes into key areas like social health transfers, $47 billion, equalization, $17 billion. So if you take the money you give to the provinces, that's $54 billion. That's That's a good almost 30-40% of that. So you can take that out. He's not going to do it. He's actually going to expand that. And I'll look at elderly benefits, employee insurance benefits, or child benefits. He's not going to cut there. So if you take 82 of that, the bulk of the budget he can't cut. Now let's look at operating expenses. Operating expenses are about $76 billion. Is he going to cut $10 billion of operating expenses? That would mean basically, in general, if you pay a salary of $5 billion, $50,000 to somebody, is he going to cut 100,000 jobs or 200,000 jobs out of the government to basically cut those costs down? He's never said that. He's actually said he wants to add jobs into Veterans Affairs Administration. So where is this guy going to find the money in terms of the budget cycle? And that's part of what we talk about in general is gap action plans. Gap action really means is how do I get myself from a negative position back to where I said I was going to be? So Mulcair's got all these promises, and I'll show you now what I mean by that. Is the NDP is looking at least right now on the preliminary counts about $10 billion in new spending. Okay, that counts their daycare model, counts the $3.6 billion they're promising for healthcare, another say $1.5 billion to infrastructure, and there's some boutique stuff that they're doing in terms of nutrition programs. They're looking at guaranteed implement supplements for seniors. So in general, they could say in total $10 billion. All he's done on commitment now on taxes, and he's backpedaled now, is he's basically said that he's going to go to 1.5% increase in corporate taxes, which likely would only bring $2 billion in. He's going to eliminate the family tax credit. That's $2.5 billion. That leaves him a gap as part of his gap analysis on his fully, he says, costed platform, about $6 billion. Where is that money going to come from? He could bring in carbon tax, and that probably will bring in some of the money. But what else is he going to do to bring in, say, another $3 to $4 billion? That we don't know. Is he going to hike GST? Well, GST impacts consumption taxes, which impacts what you pay at the consumers. We'll pay it for goods and services. That hurts the middle class, which he said he supports. The reason I bring that up is even any type of things you make in program expenses, you need to have fully funded. And he's also made the commitment, Thomas Mulcair, that he's not going to run deficits. So if he's not going to run deficits, where's this money coming from? These are questions you should be asking him, because he's basically deflected things off. He's going around pandering, trying to get to the right vote, right of center vote, or he's trying to take some of the vote from the Liberals and to the Green Party to get votes. He's not really worrying about how he's going to pay for this, because right now he's doing what Jack Layton did in 2011. Throw enough stuff out there for the low-informed voter. They won't ask questions. They just like me, so vote for me. It's up to you guys to kind of look at things and say, do I really think that $5 billion gap isn't going to come back to me in taxation? If you don't believe me, then you should look at one of my other reviews where I did basically the NDP at a provincial level. I have not seen anywhere that an NDP provincial government never raised personal taxes. Now, you will hear the NDP go after the top 1%, but what you don't hear about the top 1% is they pay about 18% of the income tax. And if you don't believe me, I've done some analysis on income tax as well. You're more than welcome to look out for my presentation or previous videos, because I discussed that. The other thing with the top 1%, it's been proven over a period of time that you will not get the money from the top 1%, because within the Income Tax Act and different things, they've got pretty good accountants, they got pretty good lawyers, they know how to work the Income Tax Act. The second thing is the top 1% are also wealth creators. They can create jobs and they can create the income that supports some of the economy. You never hear about that from the NDP. Why? Because it's easy to go after the 1% because they never vote for them. Let's talk about the Liberal Party of Canada. Justin Trudeau said the other day, after writing Stephen Harper about running deficits for 8 years, and even his loyal foot soldier, Mr. Goodale, likes to always talk about the $150 billion new debt. Guess what he says? I'm prepared to run deficits till 2019. Now let's look at his typical what he said right now. He'll eliminate the family tax credit, $2.5 billion. He doesn't plan any corporate or personal taxes to the low and middle income. He is looking at a carbon pricing or a cap and spend process. And he is looking at CP enhancement. So CP enhancement I didn't talk a lot about in terms of direct program spending, because CPP goes into a dedicated fund, doesn't get part of the actual government payout because it's funded separately. It's in an organization called CPP. investment board, and they manage that in terms of the making sure the pension fund is funded. What he has committed, and he's basically made it clearly, and he must have took this from Kathleen Wynne, he's going on a $5.3 billion spending spree in the next 10 years to increase infrastructure spending. So right now, in his hole, I see a gap of about $2.8 billion in terms of what he's planning to do. Now that likely will grow depending on what else he plans to do. But right now, as I see in terms of what he said as of this date of this video, which is August 29, 2015, this is what he plans.